Hello and welcome to this course, The Everyday Guide to Beer. My name is Charlie Bamforth. I've been part of the brewing industry for more than 40 years, leading research programs, working for the historic brewing company Bass, teaching would-be brewers at the University of California, Davis, and most recently, senior quality advisor for the Sierra Nevada Brewing Company. In this course, we are going to dig into the world of beer, its history, how different beer styles are brewed, how to choose beers, how to look after beers, how to pair beer with food, and much more besides. At the end of the course, I know that you will have a far better understanding of the wonder of the world's favorite adult beverage. Let's talk about the history of beer. It's a very proud and a very long history. Beer's been drunk for, people say variously, between 6,000 and 8,000 years. And we can trace back the history, at least in part, to what we call the Fertile Crescent, which is the sort of Mediterranean region that is around modern-day Iraq and so on and so forth. Countries like that. Back in those days, they had a nomadic existence, and they used to drive around delivering goats from place to place, looking for grass. And they used to carry barley with them, the grain from the barley. And the barley was hard and tough and wasn't very nutritious, not very nice. But somebody got it wet and it started to sprout. And we'll talk about that in the next class. And it got softer and it tasted like bean sprouts. Not that they knew what bean sprouts tasted like in those days, but tasted quite nice. And then they found they could bake it into a bread, and now it tasted really good and was more nutritious. And they stored that bread in jars, and the bread got moist. And what we now know happened is that wild yeast came in there, and they converted the sugars from the bread into alcohol, and that tasted really good when they took the liquid that came out of those jars. So they stopped the nomadic existence, they established a static lifestyle. They put the tents in a circle, they became villages and towns and cities. And so I like to say that the basis of civilization is thanks to the discovery of beer. In fact, people talk about Ninkasi, the goddess Ninkasi. And indeed, there's a hymn to Ninkasi which describes in pretty good detail the malting and brewing processes. And there are ancient depictions and pictures of people drinking beer. One of the oldest shows people drinking beer from a huge jar using straws. As we'll see later in the course, many people filter beer because it's got particles in there. The old filter that they had in those days was straws, and you would drink from the straw, and you had your own straw. And if you were really the top ends of society, you probably had a gold straw. And at the bottom end of society, you probably had a straw. But everybody drank out of straws. I don't recommend it these days. Drink it out of a glass. If you go to the British Museum, you can see funerary models. These are models depicting brewing, depicting the making of the bread and the crumbling of the bread into jars. It's always women doing this job. The women, for the longest time, have been the brewers. We call women brewers brewsters. And these funerary models are so called because they were put in with the dead body going to the afterlife. It was a gift to the gods. In ancient Egypt, who inherited the brewing traditions from Sumeria. Indeed, beer, onions, and bread were the most important items in the Egyptian diet. It has been said that the people who built the pyramids were paid with beer, onions, and bread. It was a cashless society. And now the Egyptians passed on their brewing knowledge to the Greeks and the Romans. But of course, in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, the higher classes, should we say, they drank wine. And beer was for the proletariat. Beer was for the rest. These are the first days of beer snobbery. The reality is that beer probably emerged and evolved separately in different parts of the world through spontaneous fermentation. People, if they had things that could be fermented, they would become fermented by yeast that was all over the place in the jars and so on and so forth. So you can look back to ancient archaeological digs in places like Britain to actually see that the history of beer is very, very long and old indeed. Now, you've probably heard of Pliny the Elder. Note the pronunciation. Indeed, you've probably heard of a famous beer from California that is called Pliny. And Pliny the Elder, from the current era, 23 to 79, talked about Cerevisia in Gaul and Syria in Spain. And I can quote, "The whole world is addicted to drunkenness. The perverted ingenuity of man has given even to water the power of intoxicating where wine is not procurable. Western nations intoxicate themselves by moistened grain." So this is the first wine snobbery in print. Pliny the Elder celebrating wine and, if you like, decrying beer. So let's consider a little bit the British roots, and let's move on now to 1086. Any British schoolboy or girl should know that in 1086 there was the Domesday Book. This was William the Conqueror's record of all that was present in his new part of the empire. And back in those days at St. Paul's, that was a monastery. It doesn't look anything like St. Paul's Cathedral these days, but the monks of the monastery back then in 1086 were brewing 70,000 gallons of beer a year in that monastery. Brewing progressively went from the home through to the monasteries, and in many ways the monasteries perfected the technology of brewing beer. And indeed they would ascribe letters, X's, to the strength and quality of that beer, X, double X, triple X. The monasteries then passed on that knowledge again back to those people in their homes. People in their homes were the brewing for themselves. And beer, ale as it would have been in those days, was the drink for all times of day, for breakfast, for lunch, for supper. And everybody in the home drank beer. Even the younger people drank beer. There was no tea and coffee in England, for example, in those days. And out of this domestic brewing came the brew pub. People brewing at home, the brewsters at home, they would start to sell their beer to other people. They would have the brewery in the back and the front room. They would open it up for people to come along and drink beer. And they made two types of beer. When they first of all extracted the grain, they came out with very strong liquid. And when they fermented that, they got high levels of alcohol. But then they would take the grains at the end of that extraction and they'd extract them a second time. We call it mashing, as you will hear. So they mashed a second time. There were fewer sugars. So when they fermented those, there was less alcohol. And they call that small beer. And it was a small beer that was consumed by the children. In the brewing process, there's a boiling stage. For both the stronger beers and the weaker beers, a small beer, there's a boiling stage. And in that boiling stage, you kill off pathogenic organisms, okay? Or any organism that's going to do you some harm. So that was the reason why it was safer to drink beer than it was to drink water. People drank water, they got sick. If they drank beer, they didn't. And that's because of this boiling stage. Of course, they had no idea that that was the reason why, but that was the reality. So the whole family drank beer. Now, for the longest time, there have been rules and regulations about brewing beer. And back in the 13th century, through the so-called Assize of Ale, there was established the role of the ale conner. Now, to be an ale conner was a great job. So this is what an ale conner did. There's a little bit of romance in this story, but it's a great story. These ale conners wore leather pants. And they would go to where people were brewing the beer, and they would ask to sample the beer. And the way they did it was to pour the ale onto a wooden bench, and then they would sit in it. What do you do for a living? I go sit in beer. And if there was still sugar in that beer, it hadn't been properly fermented, they would stick to the bench. They couldn't get up. But if the sugar had been converted into alcohol, After a few minutes, they could stand up easily and the beer just wash away down these leather pants, the ale conner. But the question is, how did they know where there was beer to be had? So what, or to be tested, what they had to do, the brewster had to do, was to put a pole outside the establishment with an ivy bush or a bush or an ivy plant on it to indicate that there was beer ready for testing. But then, how do you know which bar is which pub is which? And the answer is they had to identify them. They got a metal ring and they hung things in the ring. So they might hang an old boot in there. And so the establishment became the Old Boot. And there might be keys. So the establishment might become the Cross Keys. And this is the origin of the beer sign, the pub sign, that you will go to see if you are in the British Isles. Pubs are identified by a name. Obviously, you could only have one pub called the King's Head. And it's very difficult in those days to have the coach and horses, but it's easy now when you've got signs, painted signs. By the early 14th century, there was one brew pub for every 12 people in England. Now, people get excited about the craft brewing revolution in the modern era, but just think of a time when there was one pub for every 12 people. And it was, I say, the role of the brewster, sometimes called the alewife. Now, a word about ale. Ale means something different now to what it did back in the Middle Ages in the British Isles. Medieval ale was not flavoured with hops. It was flavoured with something called gruit. Now, gruit was proprietary blends of herbs and spices to give flavour to beer, but also to act as a preservative. So there are things like rosemary and yarrow and coriander and bog myrtle and caraway and peppers and pine roots and spruce and potato leaf and tobacco. But there was also things like wormwood and gentian and chicory and strychnine. Now, please, if there's any would-be craft brewers out there, leave out the strychnine, okay? But back in the day, these are the sorts of things that were used, and different people had different blends by way of gruit. In mainland Europe, it's got to be an Englishman who uses terms like mainland Europe, they were using hops, and they'd been using hops for a good long time. Now, the important thing about hops is they are antimicrobial. The bitter substances from hops will prevent the growth of several different types of bacteria. So hops is a preservative. In the days before hops, in the old ale days in England, for example, then the ale had to be quite alcoholic. And the alcohol served the role of preventing bacteria from growing. But if you put hops in there, you don't need quite such a high alcohol content. So when they started putting hops in the ale in England, the beer was thinned out a bit, made less alcoholic. So around the time of King Henry VIII, they called hops a wicked and pernicious weed. But anybody who's tasted beer that doesn't contain hops will realize in this day and age that hops really are very nice to have in beer. Actually, St. Hildegard von Bingen, who was a person who first drew attention to the role of hops in beer, stopping what was called putrefaction and lending longer durability. So by 1688, I'm racing through history now, there's more than 12 million barrels of beer drunk every year in Great Britain for a population of 5 million. 12 million barrels, 5 million people. Even infants, of course, drinking the small beer, scarcely ever drank water. And the beer in Britain, particularly in England, got a good reputation. And as we'll hear when we talk about beer styles, got a good reputation in the imperial courts of the Tsars and Tsarinas of Russia, starting with Peter the Great. Now, back in the mid-18th century, a man by the name of William Hogarth came up with 2 lithographs. The first of these was called Beer Street. And in this depiction of Beer Street, it is a scene of wealth, prosperity, good cheer, and healthfulness. There are people quaffing foaming mugs of beer. There's men painting pub signs. There's lots of building work going on. Everybody's happy. Lots of reading going on. Just a wonderful, thriving location. The only business that was suffering was the pawnbroker. And the pawnbroker's sign, the 3 balls, was falling off because nobody needed to go to the pawnbroker. They were all so happy, healthy, and wealthy. Hogarth then painted Gin Lane. And the contrast is amazing. This was scenes of debauchery, illness, wildness, evil. Buildings were falling down, absolute chaos. And the only business that was doing a thriving one was the pawnbroker. And the sign was standing proud as everybody was desperate to go pawn things to get money to buy gin. Now, I, with slight tongue-in-cheek, say this is why you should drink a noble beverage, beer. For the longest time, it has been a drink to be associated with a wonderful lifestyle. Now, also around that time, in the mid-18th century, Watt and Trevithick worked on the steam engine. And the steam engine, of course, spawned the Industrial Revolution. So now you had big factories that were powered by engines. And instead of having very much an agrarian, domestic lifestyle where people grew crops and lived at home, brewed their own beer, now people went to work in the factories. So the brewing was now carried out by what were called common brewers, people whose business on a large scale was the brewing of beer. And there were several examples of that in England, names like Whitbread from 1742 and Bass from 1777, and in Ireland, Guinness from 1759. Still, a lot of beer drunk. By 1810, there were 48,000 alehouses for 8 million people in the United Kingdom. Now, or Great Britain as it would have been in those days. Now, all of this drinking was starting to register concerns with people for productivity, and the first types of temperance movement were started off. And right the way through to the war years in the early 20th century, people registering concerns about alcohol, including beer. Indeed, there were strong voices in the British government in World War II that wanted a ban on alcohol. And they wanted the raw materials to go to food production. But they calculated and showed that if the beer supply was halved, cut in half, and the barley went to feed chickens, then the result would be 1 extra egg per month in the ration, and a lot of public discontent. So they carried on brewing beer. Slightly weaker, but they carried on brewing beer. A lot of the history of brewing, of course, started in the British Isles. But of course, Germany and other countries in Europe also have a very proud brewing history. In fact, the Western brewing industry really first became established in regions of Bohemia, which is now the Czech Republic, and Bavaria. And there were brewers at the court of Charlemagne who also insisted upon wholesome technology in the production of beer. Up to 500 monasteries at the time were brewing beer, especially the Benedictines. Now, it's a myth that lager has always been the beer style, preferred beer style, or the number one beer style in Germany. Of course, it was ale originally. Bottom fermentation, which we'll talk about in subsequent classes, probably started in the Bavarian monasteries. And the main driving force for the development of this beer style was the edict of Prince Maximilian I in 1533, when beer brewing was banned in the summer months. And we'll talk about that when we talk about lager-type beers. There's another significant law that was introduced in Bavaria. And that is from 1516 by Dukes Wilhelm IV and Ludwig X, who declared the Reinheitsgebot. Now, this is the German purity law and is still, to this day, highly prized and championed in Germany, and says that you can only make beer from malt, hops, yeast, and water. Now, when the Reinheitsgebot was first formulated in 1516, nobody knew anything about yeast. Yeast was still being argued over by chemists and biologists in the mid-19th century. So originally it just said malt, hops, and water. Yeast is now included. And people say, well, that's for good, wholesome reasons. Well, that's fine. You've got to remember the reason why it was introduced. One of the arguments was it would stop people from using fairly noxious and undesirable materials. There was a tendency before the Reinheitsgebot for German brewers to put cow bile into the brew as a preservative. Not a good idea. Some people argue also that it was an exercise in preserving other types of material for food use. Let's turn now to America. And the Mayflower left Plymouth, England, September the 6th, 1620, and the passengers disembarked Plymouth Rock, December the 26th, 1620. And from the log of William Bradford, he wrote, "Our victuals being much spent, especially our beer." They had run low on beer. Then there was enough for the sailors to go back to England, but not enough for the new settlers that had come into this country. So pretty quickly, they started to build breweries. And the tavern really became the center of the community. So much activity went on in the tavern, lots of meetings, and all the social gatherings would take place in the tavern. It was the center of the community. Now, of course, there was a shortage of barley. So there's a verse which reads, "If barley be wanting to make into malt, we must be content and think it no fault, for we can make liquor to sweeten our lips of pumpkins and parsnips and walnut tree chips." And of course, there's still to this day, you can buy pumpkin ale. Actually, it's more about pumpkin spice than it is about pumpkin, but nonetheless, there's a long tradition of making beer with the use of pumpkins. And in terms of hops, well, there was an early use of spruce. Actually, 1620 wasn't the first brewing activity in America. Adrian Block, a Dutchman, opened the first brewery in North America in 1613. It was a log hut in New Amsterdam, which of course became New York City. The Dutch West India Company opened the first public brewery in North America in Lower Manhattan in 1632. And the beer was primarily made out of oats. Many people in the world who are fiercely protective of barley and wheat as being the things that any decent beer should be made out of, but first beer is made out of oats. And beer was considered to be the drink of moderation and preferable to distilled beverages, which were of dubious repute. William Penn, founder of Pennsylvania, he started the first commercial brewery in his new colony in 1663. Samuel Adams, of course, was a brewer by trade. Then, of course, the English, they were very naughty, and of course introduced the Stamp Act, 1765, a fee for taverns in the form of special stamps. Of course, the good people of the colony rebelled. You've heard of the Boston Tea Party. You'll note it wasn't the Boston Beer Party. They weren't going to pour that into the harbor. But in due course, of course, there was a war. And how do you recruit an army? You give them beer. Moving on from that, let's go to one of the first of the presidents, Thomas Jefferson, quoted as saying, "I wish to see this beverage become common." What he was talking about was beer. Beer, a drink of moderation, opposed to distilled beverages. George Washington, he was a lover of porter, and he had his own recipe for beer. And then we have the history of some of the great brewing companies in the United States. Starting in 1829, with David Yingling in Pennsylvania. And Yingling still exists to this day, still brewing, and as we shall hear later on, still one of the biggest craft brewers, the biggest craft brewer in the United States of America. In 1840, there was Lemp in St. Louis and Wagner in Philadelphia, and they became the first brewers of lager beers in this country. Schaefer in 1842 in New York. And then the four biggest names that people associate with the large brewing companies in the United States came into being. In 1850, Bernard Stroh set up his brewery in Detroit. In 1855, Friedrich Müller, also a German, all these four were German, in Milwaukee. In 1860, Eberhard Anheuser bought a brewery in St. Louis, and I believe there were 40 breweries in St. Louis at that time, and this was number 26 and not doing very well and going south. But in 1861, Lily Anheuser, his daughter, married Adolphus Busch, and the rest is history. And then in 1873, Adolf Coors, stowed away on ship, found his way eventually to Golden, Colorado, to found the Coors Brewing Company. So in 1800, there were 150 breweries across the country brewing a total of 230,000 barrels. By 1873, there were 4,000 breweries, and each of them averaged 2,800 barrels. But by 1918, there were half as many breweries, 2,000, and each of them produced 20 times more beer. Rationalization, consolidation, acquisitions, and so on. A lot of beer being brewed and drunk, and a lot of people concerned about it. And so eventually we encountered the unfortunate episode of Prohibition. In fact, 13 states became dry between 1846 and 1855. When people talk about Prohibition, many people talk about Carrie Nation in Kansas, and she and her hench lady friends would carry hatchets, and you'd be peaceably drinking your beer, and along would come Carrie Nation and her cronies, and they would smash your beer to pieces. There were people who were rather better organized than that, and eventually concerns about productivity in World War I led to the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, the Volstead Act, of January 1920, and Prohibition. What was the impact of Prohibition? Well, there was illegal home brewing. There were lots of dubious things being imported quietly from other places. There was bootlegging. There were speakeasies. It has been said that before Prohibition, there were 15,000 saloons in New York. And a year after the Volstead Act, there were twice as many speakeasies. And there was, it has been said, a 500% increase in drunk driving in Chicago. And Al Capone became the most important beer person in the United States. So it wasn't a great experiment. So we turn to 1933. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Democrats, slogan, a New Deal and a pot of beer for everyone, and the 21st Amendment, which made Prohibition a state issue. The last state to emerge from dryness was Mississippi in 1966. Now, Prohibition happened elsewhere as well, and one of the crazier examples was Australia and New Zealand, where they introduced something called the 6 o'clock swill. And what they did was open the bars at 5 o'clock, 5 p.m., and close them at 6 p.m. So what happened is people would pile out of the offices and the factories, they'd pile into the bars, all the beer was already laid out, you'd grab 2 glasses, and you'd knock them back and put them down, and somebody would hose in beer. And so you'd be frantically drinking to try to get your buzz, should we say, before the bar closed at 6 o'clock. If you put pressures on people to do strange things, they'll do strange things. And that's one of the stranger things I've ever heard of. So let's go back to the United States, and let's go to 1945. By now, there were 465 breweries in the United States. The brewing business had recovered, and each of them was averaging 190,000 barrels of beer each per annum. It's a lot of beer. And indeed, around that time, or a little earlier, a man by the name of Carl von Linde developed artificial refrigeration. So now, rather than depending upon natural cold in caves, now you could actually brew the beer at any time. You could store the beer cold in the brewery, and also you could distribute it in refrigerated rail cars, bigger and bigger distances. So what happened was the breweries got bigger and bigger, but they were serving wider and wider hinterlands, shipping the beer vast distances, which allowed mega breweries, and fewer of them, as we shall see in a later class. And now finally, let's turn to one other US President, Jimmy Carter, who in 1978 signed the legislation to make home brewing legal on the federal level in the United States. Lots of people who were already quietly brewing at home could now come out, brew their beer, and also start to develop companies, and thus we have the start of the craft brewing revolution, an exciting new times in the history of brewing in this world.